Hello and welcome to the EduChanger podcast, where we look at the real stories behind educational transformation. My name is Bronwyn Lodsey and I'm a passionate educator in New South Wales, and it's my pleasure to invite you into these conversations today.
I began my story of education wanting to make a difference in the lives of young people. It's mathematics. I do love my subject, but these people are human beings first, students second. I am what you would describe as a reluctant leader. How do you find opportunities? And the short answer is, well, you work for them. I realized that leadership is really that thing which defines so much else about the structure of our schools. If I think about teaching and learning as a car on the highway of learning heading somewhere, pedagogy has to be in the driver's seat. Then get into those classrooms. Get an accurate picture of reality. There is no substitute to actually being there and seeing immediately what's going on, what the teachers are doing, what they love, the things that they find challenging. The schools and the systems that we work with, they will come and they will go. But the individuals who we get to make a lasting imprint on, that's something that will truly stretch off into eternity. That anyone can be an educational change maker if we're willing to embrace our colleagues and work together with them to make that change.
My guest today is Professor Eddie Wu, one of the most genuinely transformative and famous figures in Australian education. Eddie's story of influence began in 2012 when a student in his class became seriously ill and couldn't attend school. Eddie began filming those lessons in what we now know as WooTube, a YouTube channel that has over 2 million subscribers with hundreds of millions of views, reaching students, teachers and curious minds in virtually every country on earth. Yet what made WooTube and Eddie's work so remarkable isn't just its scale, but its effect, helping students to love mathematics. Within New South Wales, Eddie works for the Department of Education, leading the teacher growth team to help shape all instruction in education at a systemic level, supporting teachers, informing curriculum, and advocating for approaches that meet students where they are at in their learning. He is a professor of practice for the University of Sydney, contributing to research and initiatives that reimagine how mathematics and learning is taught and experienced at every level. Across Australia, Eddie is currently hosting the TV show on Channel 10, Ultimate Classroom, and other radio and television titles to his name, too many to list here. Internationally, Eddie is so prestigious that he is listed in the top 10 in the Global Teacher Prize. Professor Wu inspires other teachers, reshapes institutions, and challenges an entire culture to reconsider what mathematics is, what learning is, who it's for, and why it matters. What makes Eddie Wu an education changer isn't any single achievement. It's the thread that runs through all of his work, an unshakable belief that mathematics is a universal language that belongs to everyone, and a willingness to do whatever it takes to enable as many people as possible to learn. Eddie Wu, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Bron, thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Now, the first question that we're going to investigate is that although there's so much to discover about you in your articles, in your shows and your podcasts, one of the first places that you like to start is not actually mathematics learning or research, it's people. Can you unpack that for us?
Absolutely, Bron. For me, this is a very natural place to begin because mathematics as a subject, even though these days it's what people know me for today, that's not where I began. I began my story of education wanting to make a difference in the lives of young people. And I went into mathematics kind of as a little bit of an accident. Accident's not the right phrase, but I didn't plan it. It wasn't my original goal or intention. And I think one of the things that illustrates this so powerfully is a memory of mine from my first year of university. Bron, I was sitting there in the lecture theatre, and there were a couple hundred of us there, all of the secondary teachers, Bachelor of Education, Bachelor of whatever else it was, because all the different subject areas were represented. And I remember the lecturer, right at the start of the session, he said, okay, we've got a wide range of people here in this room. I want to know, what do you teach? And he went and sort of pointed at different people, and people would say, raise their hand and say, I teach science, I teach English, I teach history. And he looked at all of us after he'd surveyed 4 or 5 different people and he said, all wrong. you teach students, not subjects. And obviously that memory has stayed with me all of these years later, more than 20 years down the track, because I think that as much as I care about the knowledge and the skills and the concepts that I'm developing in my students, they are first and foremost fellow human beings who I want to care about holistically. And I love that the particular part of what I'm developing in them is mathematics. I do love my subject, but these people are human beings first, students second. And I think there's a counterintuitive way in which we can better support and develop and cultivate them as students if we think of them first as human beings and not only students.
I completely agree. And it's not just an altruistic phrase that you're saying here. Can you give us a practical example of if I walked into a room where you were teaching with that mindset about the people in front of you rather than just content, what that might look like?
For sure. I think the first most obvious thing that you would notice, Bron, or that anyone coming into my classroom would probably stand out to them, is it's the kinds of interactions that I have with my students. So I remember actually there were a few teachers of mine who were extremely knowledgeable, but because I am not particularly gifted at mathematics, they knew that if I was kind of, grinding along on the work and not causing any trouble, they probably would not pay any attention to me because I was never going to be a high flyer or a competition winner or an Olympiad competitor in mathematics. So, I was not going to be, if you think about like a talent scout looking for the best, I was not going to be on anyone's list for that. And so I just kind of flew under the radar. But for me as a teacher, I'm not just looking out for that student who is the most gifted, most talented. I actually want to think about every single student, where it happens to be that I'm meeting them on their learning journey, and how do I take them to the next step? So say, for example, if I'm in a year 7 class, I might be teaching the beginnings of, introduction to algebra to year 7. That's something that we do in stage 4. But I know that in an average class of 30 year 7 students, there's probably going to be 5 to 10 of those students who absolutely have not met all of their stage 3, year 5 and 6 outcomes, and actually have a whole lot of conceptual blocks missing before I can introduce this big new idea. Because I care about my students, aside from whether they understand algebra or not, I actually want to go back and say, all right, you're a person who I want to develop as a mathematician. If you're not ready for algebra today, if that's not on my lesson plan, then I actually need to come to you where you're at your point of need and spend time with you and work out what that issue is. If you're in year 7, this is my first year with you and I need to get to know you as a person, what things in your context and interests I can perhaps draw on that can connect you to the learning, because if a student's like that, they maybe haven't had the best time in my subject over the last few years. So all these little things are, for me, an overflow of the way I think about every learner in my classroom. They're a person first. I want to know where they're at and how I can help them grow.
And I think that is the heart of education change, isn't it? Lives affecting lives and going on for the greater good. I really appreciate that. You became really famous through WooTube that you'd set up, and you had such a strong heart for the classroom, that practice, which you still do. But can you talk us through what happened on that journey, moving from the classroom into mathematic leadership instruction, what you thought it was, what it can be, and what you advocate that it should be?
That's an enormous question, isn't it, Bron? I am what you would describe as a reluctant leader, certainly historically. I was not that kind of person who, and no discredit to these people, by the way, some of them are my best friends, and I have great admiration for people who've mapped out their 5-year plan and know exactly what series of promotions they're going for and what experience they need to develop so they can be in the right place at the right time. I would love to have been that strategic, but I wasn't. I saw, for me, there were things about the way that I was teaching that I saw came out of the way my faculty and my school were led. And I realized that leadership is really that thing which defines so much else about the structure of our schools, what student learning looks like, leadership creates that culture. And I started to realize that there were certain things that I would never be able to change and never be able to do differently unless I was willing to take that step and say, what does the next layer of influence look like? Now, I came to enter into, as you said, mathematics leadership within a school, and I enjoyed it. I learned a lot about it, but I also realized that there was all of these different dimensions to leadership. And for me, I don't think this is exhaustive, but the three main branches of leadership I think that there are in a school are management, well-being, and curriculum and instruction. And I think that, and I'm making a sweeping generalization here, but I think I've seen enough schools that I've got enough data to back this. I think for the most part, schools do the first two pretty well. We have, pretty much every school has very strong structures around the people who are assigned to the administration and management and logistics of a school, without which a school's wheels would fall off, everything would catch fire. Thank goodness that we have people who can administer and organize all of the different things that can make the ship of a school sail and reach its goals. We're also pretty good at managing the welfare and well-being of our students, because we know it is, at the front, at the foreground of all our work with students is their emotional and psychological well-being. But that last one, curriculum and instruction, I think there are some pockets of educational settings that do it really well, but I always feel as though it's one of those, I don't know if listeners have seen that 2x2 matrix of importance and urgency. There are some things that are urgent, really not that important. They catch our attention and we kind of get on the hamster wheel of doing them, but they can also distract us from things that are not urgent. No one's going to be on your case if this doesn't get done, and no one's going to be looking at your KPI saying like, hey, where have you been investing in this? But they're ultra important because they define who we are as teachers and the learning experience of our students. And I think curriculum and instruction can often fall into that bucket. Are we really investing in what our classroom practice and pedagogy look like? Thankfully, many people do, but I think systematically, we've got a lot of work in that space. So that, for me, seeing the importance of that and then wanting to create the roles and structures and teams to do that better across a large system in New South Wales public schools, for me, that's been kind of my journey of development as I've thought about leadership over the years.
I mean, it's really the reason why this podcast exists. It means a lot to my heart to hear the way that you are continuing to invest, not just in the things that people can see, but the behind the scenes work of working with teachers, working in whole systems to increase the learning outcomes for young lives. And I say that as someone who is transformed by education, by someone looking at finding me and telling me that I can learn, which is why I'm like this. So let's go into that bigger branch of instructing curriculum and teaching and learning on a bigger scale. You work across the Department of Education in all of New South Wales. You are a professor of practice for the University of Sydney. We know that each school context is unique, but can you tell us what are some of the strategies that you've seen put in place that have made change? What professional development has been really helpful, whether in a mathematics setting or otherwise? Love to know.
Got a couple of things that jump to mind, Bron, when you ask this question. So the first one, just kind of harking back to the question itself. I mean, you mentioned sort of the premise there was that, yes, every setting is different to every other setting, right? And I love the way Dylan William puts this when he says, nothing works everywhere and everything works somewhere. So the really, truly interesting question is, under what conditions do certain things work and why? So, you acknowledge that in your question and then have them put to me to say, well, then what works sort of cross, right? And I wonder if we could actually first ball those together. I like to think about the fact that change is the only constant. the only thing that is going to remain consistent is the fact that things are not consistent and that there's so much of a dynamic environment that things are constantly shifting and changing. And so I guess in some ways, one of the things which I think is most universal is that being able to take an idea, take a practice, take a strategy, and then say, this needs to be adapted and modified based on what this school community needs, where these students are at in terms of their own mindset to learning. What about the teachers and their own particular point in their experience journey that they're at? Say, for example, some of the schools that I work with, you've got School A, where you've got a really diverse mixture of different ages, and because you've got generational differences in, say, for example, a mathematics faculty, you've got disagreements and challenges over what we think are better pedagogical approaches, what even kind of mathematics we want to try and teach. And of course, this is true in every subject discipline area. Then you might have another school. Let's talk about School B. They've got actually 9 out of 10 teachers that are in their first 3 years of teaching. A number of them are out of field. So they're teaching in a subject area that they don't have a tertiary qualification in. And so, I mean, they're hungry, they're sponges for learning, but they don't have a deep well of experience to draw from. And they're teaching a lot of that curriculum for the very first time. And then let's look at School C. School C is one of those schools that is so wonderful to teach at. You go there to retire. So you got a bunch of staff who are in their last 5 to 10 years of their career. They've seen a lot of different initiatives and ideas come and go. And so they're pretty skeptical about any kind of new suggestion or practice that comes along. Schools A, B, and C are going to need wildly different things when it comes to professional learning. But the one thing that I will do in all 3 of those settings is that, as I often say to my team, there's a reason why you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Go in there. If you were the person leading professional learning and developing curriculum instruction, then get into those classrooms. Get an accurate picture of reality. There is no substitute to actually being there and seeing immediately what's going on, what the teachers are doing, what they love, the things that they find challenging. There's this wonderful Japanese word that I learned a few years ago called gemba, which very roughly translates to the actual place where the work is happening. Maybe it's the assembly line in the factory, or maybe it's the doctor's office where the GP meets with their patient one-to-one, or maybe it's in the classroom. There's no substitute to hearing second or third hand about what's going on there. Surveys aren't going to cut it. All of this big data we're going to use, you need to get into that space and see it for yourself. So I think probably that's the biggest place that I would go for all instructional leaders out there. Get in there and develop a direct understanding of what the experience and the practice looks like. But I guess returning back to your question, because I feel like I've dodged the question a little bit, I think the other thing that has been most widely and universally useful to me is about dealing with the complexity and nuance of all of the different approaches to teaching and learning, and being able to say, okay, I need to be able to synthesize and integrate all these different approaches that make sense for my students, for the concepts I'm trying to teach, and for me as an educator. There are a lot of things which I remember being told by experienced teachers when I was in my first 2 or 3 years teaching. They'd say, do this, and I would try it, and it would absolutely fall flat on its face. And I'd come to realize some of it was because I just didn't know how to do effectively the thing they were describing, but others were also just not fit for my personality and the way that I'm wired. And teaching, like many professions, it's a function of our personality and individual character. It's one of the best and most wonderful things about it, that we get to convey who we are, our very identity, to our students, not just a few facts and formulas. So I think that being able to wrestle with the complexity and nuance of, say, for example, how does explicit teaching fit with an inquiry learning approach to teaching? That's a really complicated question that takes weeks and months and years to dig down into, work out how it looks for you. So hopefully that's helpful to people thinking about instructional leadership across a range of contexts.
And would this be a fair summary that, in a sense, it's that authentic diagnostic process of going into your team's classrooms or a different school, and hearing from and observing from students and teachers to start thinking and piecing together what is going well and what is needed in that space.
Bron, I think authentic diagnostic process is exactly the right phrase. My mum, when she was alive, was an excellent cook. And I was always very frustrated when I tried to replicate the things that she would make. My sister wrote a cookbook as my mum was in her final years of life of all of the family recipes. And I would look at some of them and I would do my best to follow them to the letter. And I realized after many years of not really succeeding at ever producing those flavors and tastes that I remember from my childhood, I realized that the thing I was missing was that I actually have a very poor sense of smell. And smell and taste are extremely closely linked. And the thing that I lacked was the ability to diagnose as I was cooking, the thing that my mum did, kind of almost without thinking, instinctively. She would, every step, taste, make an adjustment. And I think that there's something for leaders and educators for the way that we taste what's going on in the classroom and then adapt as we need to go. I mean, that's, I think, would have made me a better chef, and I think it's part of what makes me an effective educator.
I completely agree. Let's keep going down this process of thinking through challenges in education, including the issue of technology. Eddie, from your perspective, seeing this intersection of technology and mathematics instruction, or just instruction in general, what would you say is helpful and what have you seen that you would say is harmful?
Pedagogy has to be the driver. If I think about teaching and learning as a car on the highway of learning heading somewhere, pedagogy has to be in the driver's seat, because I know, and Ron, I'm sure you've seen as well, and if our listeners have been teaching for anything longer than 5 or 6 years, every time a new technology gets introduced, there's a lot of excitement around it, and we think, wow, okay, what can we do with interactive whiteboards or with these fancy textbooks or these laptops that are just suddenly in every child's lap? And look, I don't want to be, someone who is overly skeptical of new tools when they come in, because I think it's very important to be willing to experiment and be on the bleeding edge. But I also know that it's misguided to think that the technologies themselves and the companies developing those technologies are going to be a reliable compass for how to use any of these tools for educational value. We have to think about, okay, let's think about large language models and the effect that they have. It's really exciting to me what students can do with these new tools, right? But if cognitive offloading has benefits, it also has disadvantages. For every benefit of freeing up my mind from something which, honestly, I want to be able to think about something different and more interesting. Am I particularly worried about how this line in the calculation is done or how these particular words are spelt? If that's not the thing I'm really interested in, and I can free up my brain to be thinking about something more sophisticated and challenging, then wonderful, cognitive offloading is a great advantage. But if I'm setting my students the task of writing an essay that can construct a line of argument and logical reasoning that can demonstrate to me that they understand the different causes and effects in this proof ecosystem, historical setting, whatever it happens to be, if they're using the AI to do an end run around that, well, then I've actually just short-circuited their ability to do the real learning. So having pedagogy and thinking about the actual experience I want my students to have in the driver's seat, making the decisions, I think for me, that's the single biggest priority as we embark on this new and very rapidly moving AI train, which is just the latest in a long series of technologies, which have changed the way we teach and learn, as they should. But we want to be thoughtful and critical and measured as we experiment and try new things.
To push you a little bit further, is there anything that you've seen or tried that you think is managing to balance that offloading to push students into a more critical place, or critiquing, these models?
Okay, here's the way I would answer this question. And it's going to take a bit of a left turn, but I promise I will try and land the plane again. I remember when I was probably in my first few years of teaching and interacting with that thing in the New South Wales mathematics syllabus called working mathematically. Now, anyone who doesn't teach maths who's listening to this might think, oh, what's that about? The way I would describe it, going back to that culinary metaphor that I was thinking about with my mom, working mathematically is that set of skills that you use no matter what cuisine you're cooking, or no matter what kind of strand of mathematics you're learning. So whether you're doing number and algebra, measurement geometry, probability and statistics, which can sometimes feel quite separate, no matter which field of mathematics you're exploring, you are going to be using understanding and fluency, you're going to be reasoning, you're going to be communicating, and what's often listed as the last one, you're going to be problem solving. Now, problem solving is about, thinking about something that's unfamiliar and non-routine. Now, the reason why I'm thinking about problem solving related to this conversation about technology is because you cannot give a question to any group of students and say, here's your problem solving question, boys and girls. I want you to have a go for the next few minutes. And the reason why you cannot describe a question as a problem solving question is because if by definition it's meant to be an unfamiliar, non-routine type of thing, where you don't have a formula, you don't have an algorithm, then for any given students, that will be problem solving for some of those students and it will not be problem solving for others. In that same vein, I think that any technology can be both helpful and disastrous for the same set of 30 students, depending on how it is that they interact with it, what instructions and what direction the teacher has provided for those students and how to use that technology. I've seen students use AI for brainstorming and it's been wonderful. And it's pushed people to be more creative and it's challenged their thinking and all those kinds of things. And I've seen that same class, different corner of the classroom, same activity, same teacher, same everything, except they've used the AI to do their brainstorming for them and it's become a substitute for them really generating their own ideas. I think that's one of the great dangers of generative AI. So I promise I'm not just trying to sit on the fence, but I really think it depends entirely on how the tool is used.
I actually appreciate your nuanced thinking. And when I was doing my research on you, Eddie, I saw that you did English Extension 2. And as an English teacher, I just want to point out your wonderful critical thinking capabilities and language that you use to articulate these really important nuances where one use may be helpful or harmful depending on the given context. So I really appreciate it.
Mrs. Yates, my English Extension 2 teacher, will be delighted to hear you say that. But I do think, there are just so many easy false dichotomies that we fall into. And education doesn't have this market cornered, but I feel sad sometimes when I see all the blogs and the posts and the Substacks going here and there and just generating all of this anger when we're on the same team. And if we can see that actually we are trying to solve these very complex problems together, I think we'd make a lot more progress.
And in an interesting way, you began by speaking about the thoughtfulness that's required to be a really effective educator for students. But that same thoughtfulness you're essentially advocating should be applied to our pedagogical approaches. And I appreciate that. Circling back to what you heard at university and now where you are now, what are some things that you've read or are reading? What is influencing you at this moment in your educational thinking?
Bron, I promise I'm not dodging the question, but before I get to directly address what you've asked about what I'm currently reading, I do have something in my mind. I really appreciate that you've sort of drawn me back to, teachers' first encounter, all that huge body of academic research about education and what works in classrooms when we were studying to be teachers. And I just feel like it's worth, at least for me, autobiographically, acknowledging the fact that my relationship with academia and research, and I just wonder if there's any other teachers listening who can resonate with this, is that I kind of fell out of love with educational research and evidence as I progressively went through my university degree. I think at the beginning, I was, as many first-year education students can, sort of empathize with, I was very excited. As I was reading this, I was like, wow, this is amazing. I've never thought about this way of conceiving of learning. That was exciting. But the deeper I went down the rabbit hole and I started learning about all of the developmental psychology and Piaget and Vygotsky and all of these different acronyms and sort of mental constructs that I didn't have language for before, I started to feel like, is this relevant to me as I'm getting ready for my first professional experience placement as I become a student teacher? Is all of this theory actually going to help me in the classroom? And I think, as many pre-service teachers can attest, my first experience back in school, on the other side of the staff room door, I loved it. I was very well cared for and supported, but it was quite a violent, traumatic experience. I definitely don't feel like I was quote unquote ready for it. And a lot of what I heard from the experienced educators who I was working with was, forget about all that stuff you've read in the textbooks. Let me show you what it's really like in genuine classrooms with real live students in front of you. And as I then entered, into my first few years of full-time teaching, I think I kind of adopted that pragmatic approach to saying, yeah, the research says all that stuff, but my understanding of the students and how to work effectively with them is now born out of my experience rather than stuff I've read. But I've been teaching for, it's almost 20 years now, which is simultaneously both an unfathomably long amount of time for some people, and also like, yeah, kid, come back when you got some real runs on the board, right? But that for me has been long enough that I've actually circled back to realizing that all those many millions of words that have been written over the decades about how to effectively cultivate a classroom environment that helps the broad diversity of students whom we teach to learn and grow, that's solving really difficult, challenging problems that require intense cognitive work to understand, that are not things that you can necessarily just work out by experience. All the cognitive biases that we bring into the classroom are things which mean that we don't even see some of the things that we experience. We're there living it, but we don't realize what we need to draw out of that to learn to change our own practice. So that is an extremely long-winded way of saying,
I love it.
I've come back to really enjoy and appreciate the world of research and evidence. Because you specifically asked me what I'm reading right now, I'm going to give you one example that I'm 3/4 of the way through reading this book, and it's called How We Learn. That's a really generic sounding title. So I should tell you who the author was, but I'm slightly embarrassed to say I don't know how to pronounce this author's name because I've only read his name. I've never heard it said aloud, but before I tell you how I would pronounce it, I'm just going to draw on something I learned from Dr. Karl Kusolnicki. He said, I love people who mispronounce things because that means they read it by learning, not by someone else telling them. So I'm about to butcher this pronunciation, but people listening can appreciate I'm doing this my best job. So How We Learn was written by Stanislas Dehaene. I'm hoping I sounded confident enough for people to go and look up and work out the right person I'm thinking about, particularly about the development of the brain, what neuroplasticity really means, because that phrase gets thrown around a fair bit. What are the implications of it for teachers and learners in classrooms? And I'm loving it. It's really challenging some of the things which I've thought that I knew about learning from watching many generations of students, watching my own children as well. But it's challenging some of the thoughts that I've got. So I humbly submit that to anyone else interested in a new read.
Wonderful. Is there anything from it that you want to specify that it is challenging just before we move on?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so one of the interesting claims that this book makes, and I'm phrasing it in that way because I think that going back to the world of research and evidence, it's easy, I think, to find something to read which is extremely compelling, resonates with your experience, and just say, this is what's come down off of Mount Sinai. These are my 2 stone tablets that I'm going to apply to everything in what I'm teaching. And I have had that experience myself before and have learned over the years to realize that I probably don't believe everything that anyone says. And I want to be critical, have my own sort of thinking cap on as I'm reading and perceiving and challenging what I'm thinking. So this is a claim that's made. I submit it to the listeners. I wonder what they think of this. It's about the role of mistakes, errors, and surprises in the learning process. So I've read a bit over the last few years, particularly as I don't know, it's probably 10 to 12 years ago when I first encountered all of Carol Dweck and Joe Bowler's work around growth mindset and so on. And I remember some of the things that they suggested about the importance of error making in learning mathematics, and then the counterpoint to that about the danger of developing misconceptions by getting the wrong idea or developing an unhelpful process for doing things, right? So I definitely don't believe that mistakes are magic and that simply making mistakes just has, moral value all of its own. But in how we learn, one of the things that Tahini talks about is that mistakes do have an outsized, disproportionate place in how we learn things because, I'm thinking about how I learned to ride a bike. I have this extremely strong and potent memory of every time I really, really badly fell off a bike, scraped blood everywhere, a broken bone, things like that, because those things challenged my preconceived network, all the schema, the mental framework that I had for how it is that I ride a bike. And that doing something wrong and then getting that feedback loop plays an extremely important role in the development of synaptic connections and saying, to the human learning machine, okay, don't do it this way. There's something that surprises you, which I'm going to attach all of this, mental effort toward. I'm thinking about the wonderful quote from Daniel Willingham who says, memory is the residue of thought. And a lot of thinking takes place when you make a mistake, and if you have meaningful feedback on that error, that's something which I'm still thinking about because I know there's great danger in mathematics from accidentally developing some misconceptions and then having to undo some of that and develop better conceptual understanding later. So that's the claim. As you can see, it's really challenging my thinking, but hopefully some people out there will be able to reflect on that too.
I really appreciate the honesty with which you answer these questions, Eddie. Yeah, it's refreshing and helpful, and kind of diving down deeper into your authentic, honest experiences. Probably for me, the question I most want to know is what is it that motivates you?
Oh, this is a great question. So when it comes to thinking about what motivates me at the base, most foundational level, I think there's something really important that connects back to this kind of educational change that you were referencing before, Bron. And I think sometimes there's sort of a natural instinct we can have to say, educational change that's transformational is about breadth and scale. And, I have the great joy of working in a big system with a large team, and there are great joys and privileges that come from that. But I think about this wonderful quote of C.S. Lewis's that I wish I could remember which of his books he wrote this in, but he talked about the fact that we often actually think backwards about what real impact looks like. And the way I think he says, I'm not going to get it verbatim, but he talks about how we imagine, the great people of history who have led countries and companies and societies and things like that. And they're the people who we have in our history books. We remember their names and what have you. And he said, yes, but countries and empires, it might be around for a few hundred years, if they're lucky, a few thousand years. But an individual who you can sit across from is an eternal being, a creature who's going to last forever. And so we are quite backward if we think that big change, really important impact is about breadth, because the schools and the systems that we work with, they will come and they will go. But the individuals who we get to make a lasting imprint on, that's something that will truly stretch off into eternity. In the top drawer of my desk in my office back at school, I have a little section that's set apart for cards and letters that have been written to me by students over the years. And when I'm having a difficult day, I will sometimes reach into that drawer and I will pick out a card at random and I will read a message from a young person who, in just a few words, can explain the difference I've made on their individual life. And that's often the place that I go emotionally, mentally, spiritually. When I think about what motivates me, it's those individuals. And I think even though I love working across a big system, and I'm currently working on some things that I hope will outlast me decades into the future, but it's those people. It's the heart and mind of a single person that I have the privilege of making a difference in. That's what motivates me.
I have no words. Okay, now a question that I always like to ask on this podcast to help encourage others who care deeply and are maybe working in a quietly unseen way to help their students or fellow colleagues is, can anyone be an effective teacher? Can others be an educational change agent like you, Eddie? And if so, how?
That's sneaky because that was like 4 questions in one, and I will do my best to try and stay on track. Look, let me go back to the beginning of what you asked there. I do think that there are a series of qualities that can be innate and instinctive and intuitive to someone that will really help them in their teaching journey. But I think that probably there is a much larger proportion of things that are learned behaviors and that need to be developed over time. A lot of people said to me, how'd you become a good teacher? And for the longest time, I say, for example, you asked about the videos before, and people would often ask that question to me in the frame of, why are people watching your videos? And honestly, for years, I would say, I really don't know, because there's cat videos and music and comedians on YouTube. I don't know why people are going after a very low production value experience of an everyday, New South Wales classroom. It's a mystery to me. But I came to realize that actually it's about the fact that, particularly because you mentioned English before, I'm a person who loves the narrative side of learning. Long before literacy was a widespread thing. I think we often forget that widespread reading and writing are just a couple 100 years old, which is a drop in the ocean in terms of human civilization and society. Long before that was the primary mechanism for learning, we learned through storytelling. I've always loved stories, but I wasn't, and anyone can sadly go back to me as a teacher from 14 years ago and can see evidence of the fact that I wasn't always the storyteller that I am today in my classroom. That's a skill that I've very consciously worked on and developed. I would say as well, we started off this conversation talking about the importance of relationships because I'm morbidly curious. Every few years, I do one of those Myers-Briggs personality tests, and people change over time, right? So I'm always interested to see.
And do your results change over time?
Well, this is one of the funny things. So there are 4 letters in the Myers-Briggs test, and people can obviously look it up, so I won't belabor the point. For 3 of those 4 letters, I kind of am quite borderline, so I float back and forth. But there's one letter on which I am extremely consistent. It's the first one, which most people know is either I or E for introversion or extroversion. I am consistently about a 90 to 95% introvert. And people are often surprised. Bron, you just made the face that most people do. People are often surprised to hear that because, well, teaching is so much about building relationships with people. And it's true, introverts don't do that as naturally as extroverts do. But anyone who wants to be effective in the classroom working with young people has to be able to develop those relationships. And that's not a thing that was innate or natural to me, but I've developed and worked on that and have had great mentors over the years and peers who I've watched and thought, wow, I wish I could do what they do naturally, but I can learn some of those skills myself. So I would say, coming back to your question, anyone can learn. Some people are a little further along in the journey and maybe start off with some genetic and predisposition advantages, but certainly autobiographically, I think that that's something which I evidence that you absolutely can learn. The back half of your question, which I'll try to do succinctly, is about making educational change. I mentioned before that I'm not someone who ever really thought about leadership and who somewhat stumbled upon that accidentally. And I feel extremely thankful that I've, in many ways, been in the right place at the right time to take up the opportunities that have become available to me to be able to lead change at a scale that's a little bit broader than my classroom. And I want to say two cautions about that. Firstly, about opportunity. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said, many people miss opportunity because it comes to the door dressed in overalls and it looks like work. And I know I particularly speak to some of the young people in my life, and they're like, how do you find opportunities? And the short answer is, well, you work for them. You know, what was it? How was it said? The harder I work, the luckier I get. So I think that's the first thing to be said about that. But the other is that those opportunities often come via connection. And I would be remiss if I, ended this conversation with you without really pointing out that all of the things you talked about that I've been able to be involved with in our conversation today, they've all come about by wonderful collaborations I've had with fantastic teams of people around me. Not a single thing that you can point to that I've done is something I've done in isolation. And teaching can, ironically, despite the fact that we talked a lot about how much it's about relationships and so on, it can actually be a very lonely profession sometimes. You go in there, so you spend your day surrounded by people, but sometimes you can be alone in the classroom as the only teacher and educator there. And I think high school teachers are worse at this in general. We sometimes stay in our own little silo and forget what wonderful opportunities there are for learning from our colleagues. So I feel like that's a worthwhile note to kind of close on, that anyone can be an educational change maker if we're willing to embrace our colleagues and work together with them to make that change.
I could not agree more. Eddie Wu, it has been an honour to have you today, and thank you for collaborating with me and helping me to be a better educational changer too.
My pleasure, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Reflecting on the conversation with Eddie, I'm struck by his humility. Despite all of his accolades, awards and fame, he really does have a humble heart that wants the best for his students and for all students in New South Wales. I really valued that balanced approach, that educational leadership matters, that pedagogy needs to drive our use of technology, that systems matter, but within that real change is ultimately measured in individual lives. Education is at its most powerful not when it simply reforms policy, but when it helps a young person discover confidence and possibility. And perhaps that's the balance we should always strive for, thinking boldly about education as a whole while never losing sight of the human beings at the heart of them. In fact, investing in educational systems and leadership so that we can provide better outcomes for individuals and make them the core of our choices and what we do in schools every day. A sincere thank you to the Bella Vista Hotel podcast recording room and for Ben for helping me out with tech this week. Thank you so much. See you next episode.